Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne. Chapter 20, in which Fix comes in direct contact with Phileas Fogg. During this scene, which might perhaps seriously interfere with his future, Mr. Fogg, accompanying Mrs. Uda, was taking a walk through the streets of the English town. Since Mr. Uda accepted his offer to take her to Europe, he had to think of all the necessary details for so long a journey. That an Englishman like him should make a tour around the world with a carpet-bag in his hand might pass, but a lady could not undertake such a journey under the same conditions. Hence the necessity of buying clothes and articles necessary for the voyage. Mr. Fogg acquitted himself of his task with the quiet characteristics of him. He invariably replied to all the excuses and objections of the young woman, confused by so much kindness. In the interest of my journey, it is in my programme. The purchases were made, and Mrs. Fogg and the young woman returned to the hotel and dined at the table d'hote which was subconsciously served. Then Mrs. Uda was a little tired, and went up to her room after having shaken hands, English fashion, with her imperturbable deliverer. He, Fogg, was absorbed all evening in the reading of the the Times and the Illustrated London News. If he had been a man to be astonished by anything, it would have been that not to see his servant an hour for retiring. But not knowing that the Yokohama steamer was not to leave Hong Kong before the next morning, he did not otherwise bother himself about it. The next morning, Passepartout did not come at Mr. Fogg's ring. What an honourable gentleman thought on learning that his servant would not return to the hotel, no one had said. Mr. Fogg contented himself with making his carpet-bag, calling for Mrs. Uda, and sent for a palanquin. Then it was 8 o'clock, and the high tide, of which the Carnac was to take advantage to go into passes, put down 9:30. But when the palanquin arrived at the door, Mr. Fogg and Mrs. Uda got into a comfortable vehicle. Their baggage followed them on the wheelbarrow. Half an hour later, the travellers dismounted on the wharf, and there Fogg learned that the Carnac had left the evening before. Mr. Fogg, who had counted on finding at the same time both the steamer and his servant, was compelled to do without both. But not a sign of disappointment appeared on his face, and when Mrs. Oda looked at him with uneasiness, he compelled himself by replying, "It is an incident, madame, nothing more." At this moment a person who had been watching him closely came up to him. It was Detective Fix, who was turning to him and saying, "Are you not like myself, monsieur, like the passenger of the Rangoon who arrived yesterday?" "Yes, sir," replied, "but I have not the honour—" "Pardon me. But I thought I would find your servant here. Do you know where he is, sir?" asked the young woman quickly. "What?" replied Fix. Is he not with you?" "No," replied Miss Auda. "He has not returned since yesterday, and perhaps he embarked without us on the aboard of the Carnac." "Without you, madame?" replied Fix. "But excuse my question. Do you expect them to leave by that steamer?" "Yes, sir. I too, madame. But I am much disappointed. The Carnac, having completed her repairs, left 12 hours sooner without warning anyone. We must now wait a week for another steamer." Fix felt his heart jump with joy in pronouncing these words. A week! A week! Fogg had detained a week at Hong Kong, and there would be time to receive a warrant of arrest. Chance would at last declare the representative law, and it may be judged that the stunning blow he received. But when Phileas Fogg said in a calm voice, "But there are other vessels than the Carnac, it seems to me, in the port of Hong Kong," and Mr. Fogg, offering his arm to Miss Auda, turned toward the dock in search of another level vessel leaving. Fix, stupefied, followed. It might have been said that a threat attached to him to this man, however, a chance really to abandon him whom it served so well at the time. Phileas Fogg, for 3 hours, traversed up the port in every direction, decided it was necessary to charter the vessel to take him to Yokohama, but he only saw vessels loading and unloading, to which consequently did not set sail. Fix began to hope again, but Mr. Fogg was not disconcerted, and he was going to continue his research as if he had to go as far as Macao. And then when he was accosted by a sailor at the end of the pier, "Your honour's looking for a boat?" asked the sailor, taking off his hat. "You have a boat ready to sail?" "Yes, your honour. A pilot boat, number 43, the best in the Fuca." "She goes fast?" "Between 8 and 9 knots an hour, nearly the latter. Will you look at her?" "Yes, your honour will be satisfied. Is it for excursion?" "No, for a voyage." "A voyage? You will undertake me to convey me to Yokohama?" The sailor at these words stood his arm extended, startling in his head. "Your honour's joking?" he said. "No, I missed the sail of the Carnac, and it must be at Yokohama on the 14th, at the latest, and to take the steamer to San Francisco." "I regret it," replied the but it is impossible. I offer you 100 pounds per day, and a reward of 200 pounds if I arrive on time. You are in earnest? Asked the pilot, very much in earnest. The pilot withdrew on one side, looked at sea, and went struggling with the desire to gain an enormous sum in feeling and the fear of venturing so far. Fix was in a moral suspense. During this time, Mr. Fogg had returned to Mrs. Auda. "You will not be afraid, madame?" he asked. "With you?" "No, Mr. Fogg," replied the young woman. The pilot had come forward towards the gentleman again, and was twisting his hat in his fan. "Well, pilot?" said Mr. Fogg. "Well, your honour," replied the pilot, "I can risk neither my men nor myself nor your voyage in so long a boat, scarcely 20 tons at this time of the year. Besides, we would not arrive in time, for it is 1,650 miles from Hong Kong to Yokohama. Only 1,600," said "It is the same thing." Fix took a deep, long breath. "But there might perhaps be a means to arrange it otherwise." Fix did not breathe any more. "How?" "By going to Nagasaki and the southern extremity of Japan, 1,100 miles only to Shanghai, 800 miles from Hong Kong. In this last journey you will not be able to any distance from the Chinese coast, which be a great would be a great advantage, and all the more the currents run to the north." "Pilot," replied Mr. Fogg, "I must take the American mail steamer at Yokohama, not at Shanghai or Nagasaki." "And why not?" replied the pilot. "The San Francisco steamer does not start from Yokohama, and she stops there in Nagasaki, but her port of departure is in Shanghai." "You are certain of what you are saying?" "Certain." "And when does the steamer leave Shanghai?" "On the 11th, at 7 o'clock in the evening. We have 4 days before us. 4 days, that's 96 hours, and with an average of 8 knots if we have good luck. If the wind keeps to the southeast, if the sea is calm, we can make the 800 miles which separates us from Shanghai, and you can leave in an hour. Buy enough of my provisions and hoist sail. It is a bargain. You're the master of the boat." "Yes, John Bunsey, master Tankadeer. Do you wish some earnest money?" "If it is not convenience your honour. Here are 200 pounds on account, sir. If you," here's all I said, turning towards Fick, "if you wish to take advantage." "Sir," replied Fix resolutely, "I was going to ask this favour of you. Well, in half an hour you'll be on board." "But this poor fellow," replied Miss Auda, whom Passepartout disappearance. "I am going to do all I can to find him." While Fix, nervous and fabulously angry, repaired to the pilot boat, and two others went to the police station at the Hong Kong, and Phileas Fogg there gave Passepartout's description and left a sufficient sum to find him. The same formality was carried out at the French consular agent, and the Pelican having stopped at the hotel where the baggage had taken, took the travellers back to the outer pier. 3 o'clock struck, and the pilot boat, number 43, and her crew on board, and the provisions stowed away, was ready to set sail. She was a charming little schooner of 20 tons, this Tankadeer, with a sharp-cut water and very graceful shape and long lines she called racing yacht. Her shining copper sheathing, her galvanized iron work, her deck as white as ivory, showed that Master John Bunsby knew how to keep her in good condition. Her two masts leaned a little to the rear, and she carried a brigantine foresail, storm jib, and standing jib, and she could rig up splendidly for a rear wind. She was ought to sail wonderfully well, and in fact she won several prizes in the pilot boat matches. The crew of the Tankadeer were composed of the master, John Bunsby, and 4 men. And there were of that class the hardy sailors who, in all weather, ventured out in search of vessels, are thoroughly acquainted with seasons. John Bunsby, a man of 45 years old, vigorous and well sunburnt, of lively expression, of an energetic face, and self-reliant, were well posted to his business, and inspiring confidence in the most timorous. Phileas Fogg and Miss Auda went on board. Fix was already there, and they went down step by step in the rear schooner of the square cabin, whose walls plunged out of the former cots, and above a divan in the middle there was a table lighted by a hanging lamp. It was small but neat. "I regret nothing to have better of you to offer," said Mr. Fogg to Fix, who bowed without replying. The detective felt somewhat humiliated thus taking advantage of Mr. Fogg's kindness. Surely, he thought, he is a very polite rogue, but he is a rogue. 10 minutes after the sails were hoisted, and the English flag was flying at the gaff of the schooner, and might have had schooner, and the passengers were seated on deck. Mr. Fogg and Ada cast a last look at the wharf in hope of seeing Passepartout. Fix was not without apprehension for the chance he might have brought to this place the very unfortunate young man who had treated with such indignity. There was an explanation which had taken place, from which the detective would not have gone out to take advantage. But the Frenchman did not show himself, and doubtless the stupefying narcotic still held him under its influence. Finally, Master John Bunsby gave the order to start, and the Tankadier, taking the wind under her brigantine foresail and jib, flew out into the sea bunding.